So we're doing experiences using Wikipedia in the classroom, and I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth Salmon to start us off and to say a little bit more about where this webinar is going and all of that, introducing a little bit about this collaboration.
Thanks, Sarah. So, hi everyone. I'm Elizabeth Salmon, Research Services Librarian. And, as many of you are aware, I'm here with my colleagues, Sarah Davidson Squibb, Elizabeth McMentatenko, and Kelly Abrasi. And we're also joined by several instructors who we collaborated with this past semester. And so for today, we are going to be sharing information about our Wikipedia collaboration. And then we are also hoping for those of you who are interested in doing something similar in the future, this also is intended to generate some ideas and discussion around integrating this into your curriculum. So for today, I'm going to start off by telling you more about our Wikipedia proposal. And then we are going to hear from our instructors how things went from the librarian's perspective. And then we are going to wrap up with a discussion and Q&A. Kelly is also monitoring the chat, so if you have questions, you can always put them in there as well. So our initial interest in Wikipedia came from our desire to expand on the focus of some of our information literacy sessions. And so we have typically focused those sessions on finding sources, search strategies, and developing research questions. And we wanted to just expand that to have more of a focus on information creation and evaluation. And so as a next step, we identified what we wanted students to be able to accomplish through this work. And that included identifying an information gap or need within a Wikipedia article, locating credible information to contribute to Wikipedia. We wanted students to engage in basic editing on the Wikipedia platform and how to navigate around that platform. And then we also wanted students to be able to articulate the benefits and limitations of using Wikipedia. And we're going to come back to these points, I'm sure, during our discussion and then also later on as well. And so for this collaboration, Sarah reached out to, I know, a number of you here and other instructors within the Merit Writing Program and the Spark program. And within the proposal, we first suggested introducing students to Wikipedia through a CAT courses module. And this took about an hour for students to complete independently. And through the module, we were trying to present information about Wikipedia and then walking students through creating their accounts and then making basic edits. After that, we proposed 2 library sessions. And so the first session focused on Wikipedia articles, including the article structure, content gaps, and then we moved into finding sources and some search strategies. In between the first and second session, we had students do a little bit of work on their own. And so we were asking them to select an article on Wikipedia that they could contribute to. Although for some classes, the librarian and the instructor created a list of articles that students could choose from. And then in some other classes, students were working together to draft a completely new Wikipedia article too. And so during that time between the 2 sessions, students were encouraged to start their research and then also draft their edits and contributions to have something ready for when they came into the second in-person library session. And during that second session, we tried to spend the first part of that class reviewing the different types of pages students would be interacting with on Wikipedia, and then going over some of those basic editing procedures again. So how to make an edit, and then how to add in a citation, how to record your edit, etc. And then for the rest of the second in-person session, we spent the rest of the time supporting students as they continued with their research, and then they started to make edits themselves, either in draft articles or the live articles. And then after the second session, students did have the opportunity to continue on and continue to improve their article. And I know some instructors also worked in a peer review process as well. And so on this slide, the way we sort of have these different colors here, the white indicates the librarian's involvement, and then the black text indicates what students were doing more on their own. So what I'm going to do now is pass things over to Elizabeth McMuntatengo, who is going to lead the discussion with the instructors that are here today.
All right, so thank you. I'm going to introduce our collaborators for the project, and you can see their names up here. They were Heather Deverick, Krista Frazier, Catherine Kohler, Michelle Taconis, and Jen Dean, and they worked with lower division classes. And so for this section, I'm really going to give each person 5 minutes to speak and answer these questions that will also be in the chat. And then we'll come back together and talk a little bit about the librarian perspectives as well. So I'm going to first turn it over to Heather.
Right. I lost the questions. Is it okay if you share that slide so I could look at it?
And they're in the chat too.
Oh, there they are. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So Wikipedia, so I did writing 10 and Spark. So for writing 10, we were talking about search strategies, etc. We looked at, Wikipedia, Google Scholar, and then also library databases. So, talk about how Wikipedia could be a good jumping point, in some places. For Sparks, it was a little different because, you've got that research perspective. So really where we did that class is kind of the same thing. They were researching different games. So what was interesting about games is that surprisingly, a lot of Wikipedia sites on games some of them are very well developed. Some are not. I want to say like Checkers, even though it's a very old game, had a lot of needs a citation and stuff. So it was, that was kind of fascinating. So we didn't spend as much time in Sparks, but just introducing it as a possible search tool. So I linked in both classes, I linked the assignment to their journals that they were doing. I had one ahead of time, like, hey, what are you considering researching? And then a little, touch on it after. For writing 10, it was hopefully linked to their final research paper. We started that earlier in the semester with a proposal, then we do an annotated bid, and then we do the final paper. And so it was like, for example, I had students doing first generation students and mental health, and kind of looking at the kind of problem solution thing there. Sparks was tied to a game review assignment where they're not just reviewing the game, it's like, hey, it's fun to play, etc. But also like how inclusive is it of people, ethnicity, sexuality, etc. Also looking at accessibility. So we looked at a bunch of different, lenses. And so again, kind of research out there. It is not just like you enjoy playing it. And so it was participation-ish, but tied to some of minor assignments, and also ideally helping them out with the larger ones. Like all of you, this was the first time I did this. I was trying to make it kind of low stakes, but also have that buy-in and finding that sweet spot. What was successful? I think in Sparks, it was the most successful because students, they picked the game they were going to look at. I think a lot of them, when they realized, wow, nobody's talking about this. So that was kind of exciting. I had a student in particular did on Loteria, and which has been around for a while, but didn't have a lot of citations. And luckily, Marisol Alonso had the class after me, and she walked in when I was with the student trying to help her out, and she's like, oh, here's some ideas too. And so it was neat. So we had another instructor help, and her edits are still on there. She was able to add to the background. So that I think was really cool for that student to, add to that. So I think that was neat. There was some personal pride. Another student really enjoyed, being the first to mention a new release. I think especially as a woman who plays this video game, who's looked down upon that for some time. So I think it's like, need all these people to this edit. So I think that was cool. The personal pride stuff was neat. Writing 10 was more challenging. Knowing what I know now, kind of skipping to change, because they were just kind of still investigating those topics, and those topics are still kind of weighty. I kind of wish I'd had it in the beginning of class, where kind of like Sparks, like, choose something to research for fun, and then like, wow, how accurate is Wikipedia? What would you edit? Is kind of like getting into thinking of themselves as researchers. So kind of a minorish assignment. So I would definitely, yeah. So I think the challenging was probably that buy-in, and also not having them like feel as stressed about it, and like, again, the sweet spot with that. And so, yeah, so I think in the future, writing 10, I think if I kind of kept it still that kind of low-ish stakes, I think I'd have it in the beginning as like a intro to research thing. And then, but that was it. I think it's fun. And I think I learned a lot about, like, again, the sweet spot. Buy-in, but not overly stressed about it. So I hope that was coherent, you talking about both classes.
Thank you, Heather. And we're going to go next to Krista.
Yes, I could try to turn on my camera, but it's not going to be good. But I'll turn it on. Yeah, so I actually used it with my writing 10 class, and it's a 7:30 to 9:20 class. So it is a class that I've really worked to keep engaged throughout the semester, especially with engagement being low. And then it's 7:30 to 9:20 on top of it. Yes, at night. And so I thankfully had almost no absences in every single class, which was just amazing. I had tons and tons of, I had a surprising amount of engagement. So when we had this come through the pipeline, I knew that my number one goal was to keep them engaged and to also obviously affix it to one of our assignments. So I had it scheduled for the argument of definition, which is our last essay for this semester. I normally teach 4 essays, but this semester I did 3 and scaffolded the 3. So we were trying to pick argument of definition topics, which, I mean, the students, some of the conversations made me a little anxious that they wanted to focus on. I mean, they wanted to talk about transphobia and gender. And I felt like those were fine topics for them to select for their personal essays. But in terms of navigating those discussions in class, I would quickly identify tricky sections that felt maybe like not the best topics to pick as our starting topics for understanding what an argument of definition was. So we picked family because there's so many different ideas about what a family is historically in terms of different regions, different religions, different value systems. So that was a topic that we could really explore in our argument of definition. So when we were picking a topic with Elizabeth McBun-Tatenko, we picked family. And I wanted them to do the Wikipedia sessions as part of a class session. But I wanted to make it kind of special. So just 3 times this semester, I opened up COB1's 3rd floor, and I let them work in like the empty cubicles and let them kind of spread out, and they used the Willow meeting room, and they really actually enjoyed doing the Wikipedia modules because they were allowed to work in that space that was reserved for special occasions. So overall, I felt like their conversations when we were in the library with Elizabeth and Sarah were really good. I wasn't super excited about the amount they actually edited, but I did feel like they were talking about it and they were engaging, and some students did edit. And so I feel like I can do better next time with how I handle this. But I feel like as a pilot in my class, especially with a night class where my primary concern has been keeping students engaged and excited to attend, I feel like it was a success in that level. On that level. And I feel like we picked a topic that allowed us to have a lot of really robust discussions and allowed us use Wikipedia while also understanding what is an argumented definition. So yeah, that was our experience.
Thank you, Krista. And we're going to go next to Catherine.
Hi. I just want to thank the librarians too. I was like kind of putting some notes together like before the session and like, wow, this is a great chance to kind of force myself to reflect on things, which like the end of the semester is hard to do. So it's great to hear everybody's like contributions. Okay, so the first question, how to use Wikipedia in class. So maybe a little like context about the class first. So I used this project in my Spark course this semester. And the sort of premise of the course is looking at how literacy has figured in how incarceration is conceptualized and legitimated and experienced in the United States. And I also have a kind of focus in that class on archives and archival research. So students are really thinking about how like the selection, preservation, presentation of archival materials kind of shape knowledge production and meaning making, and how can we kind of ethically and critically and effectively kind of create and navigate and evaluate and use digital archives. So prior to the Wikipedia project, Gerald Chiroma gives a couple of guest lectures in the class about to introduce students to archives and to get students kind of familiar with our special collections, and then to help them start thinking a little more critically about archives. And really it's just part of my big long-term plan of like getting to work with every single librarian every semester in every class. So it's all my plans coming together nicely. So prior to the Wiki project, students have done kind of archival research with primary sources, focusing on our UC Merced special collections. So they look at local histories of incarceration through the forced detention of Japanese Americans during World War II. And so we have a couple special collections that apply to that. There's Assembly Center newsletters and then oral histories. So they focus on those. So rather than kind of updating existing Wiki content, we were pretty surprised to find that there was no Wikipedia entry for the Merced Assembly Center. So students kind of use their primary research to generate that page initially. So they'd done a lot of thinking about and through archives and conducted some primary research at the point that we got to the Wiki project. And I'll just, let me see if I can, I'll paste, this is kind of how I described the assignment to students, which, so I'll just post it in the chat there. So yeah, I guess my goals were really to help students think through the relationship between primary and secondary sources and research, to kind of underscore the kind of constructed and contingent nature of knowledge, and remind them that it's subject to change and revision, and to invite them to kind of think critically about scholarship and its potential to advance public knowledge, or perhaps the obligation of scholarship to advance public knowledge. And also it was a great opportunity, I think, to provide them with a really authentic writing situation with some actual stakes involved. It got them really motivated to work on the project. Let's see the other question, sort of what was successful and what was challenging. So there are quite a few students who said, like, at the end of the project, I didn't think we were gonna pull it off, but we did. So, which is honestly kind of how I felt at different points. So we did manage to pull it off. It was really interesting. There was kind of a tension that I noticed with students where, you know, they're initially saying that their kind of prior knowledge and experience really emphasized that Wikipedia like lacked credibility within a research context, but they were still really didn't think that they had the authority to contribute to Wikipedia at the beginning. So there's this like, well, it's not credible, but I lack credibility to contribute. So there's this weird tension they were kind of navigating with their own role. I thought maybe I would just to kind of highlight what was successful, maybe like share, if I can share screen. Can I share screen? Yeah. Like just a high watermark, because I'm just conferencing with students today. So this is just like a screen capture of one of the sections they developed. So you can see the gallery of images they included from their archival research in Calisphere, and the text that the students kind of, or that this particular student kind of built out around it. So these are images by Dorothea Lange that were censored at the time, of people of Japanese ancestry being kind of forcibly removed to Merced. So these are all individuals who ended up in Merced. So you can see kind of what she built out and the kinds of secondary sources that she integrated to elaborate that context. And I'll put in the chat here too, like this is just on my mind because we just met. But I'll stop sharing here. There we go. I'll put in the chat here. I copied and pasted her reflection on kind of working with Wikipedia and her sources from the conference that we just had. Oh, it's too long. It's not going to let me paste it. But she said when she worked with primary sources, she learned to find the context in order to fully understand how primary sources are important and what they mean, and that using secondary sources was the best way to provide this context. And she sort of connects it to the synthesis that she did on Wikipedia. And then she talks about kind of research rabbit holes and learning to kind of think about scope of research and things like that. And that she was proud of the yeah, see Heather's chatting comment here. Yeah, that she was pretty proud of her contribution. So I think a lot of the challenges are really situational, with just like coming back from the pandemic, like Krista mentioned, with engagement. And with my project, I situated it at the end of the semester, which I think was right when people were starting to fry out. So I think maybe kind of integrating it earlier would be ideal. And now that we have a kind of foundational page, I think it gives some direction and shape to the archival research that students are doing. They can really kind of like find an underdeveloped section or a gap on the page that students developed this semester and kind of tailor their archival research in different ways that we weren't really doing before. So I can imagine that as a potential like affordance of this trial run experiment that we did this semester. And then there were, just the kind of usual technical, I think, learning curves with just getting used to how Wikipedia works. So I think for the future, I'll probably start earlier and like flip the sequence of things. Now that the initial page is developed, I think we can start with Wikipedia and then kind of tailor the archival work that they do to that end. And now that I know a little bit more about what to expect, I think I can be a little more intentional and organized with like how I outlay their secondary research as it relates to the primary sources they're working with. And focus that a little bit more. And I also think for this class in particular, like something that came up as we were working on it that I guess was unexpected was like how Wikipedia addresses primary sources. And so now that I kind of know more about that, I'd like to like have a more explicit discussion with students around those policies and kind of connect that to our critical discussions about archives and counter archives and thinking about those kinds of issues. So yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. These are really interesting. So we're going to go next to Michelle.
Hey, everybody. Give me just a second. So I think that, Catherine captured a lot of the kinds of concerns that I have also, as far as I think you're probably referencing the notability issues and the secondary source coverage. But my primary goal going into this with students was that is about showing them that we need to get more people editing Wikipedia because it's important there, because there's a documented gender and BIPOC bias on Wikipedia that can only really be addressed by getting, well, more people involved in editing Wikipedia. And so I chosen to coincide with Spark, Social Justice and Child Lit, and Writing 10, Intersectional Environmentalism. I used it, the wiki, to encourage students to engage in research and participatory scholarly discourse. So that was the concept for me personally. It did go towards part of their participation grade and progress reporting on research, as well as using campus resources requirement. Plus, it was also an opportunity, something that all of us here feel strongly about, that librarians are approachable and that you can actually speak to them and talk to them and engage with them. So I really do feel it was successful. I really wanted to show students how they could increase and improve the coverage of topics they deemed underrepresented on Wikipedia, that they could actually do something about it. I know that, there's been conversation about, I think Krista may have referenced even about there wasn't, maybe not completely feeling comfortable with the amount of editing. I kind of feel the same thing. But the fact that they got in there and they learned and they know now, I feel that is an accomplishment. The challenge overall does go back for me, and this is not something that is about the project itself or anything that has to do, it's about Wikipedia overall. And again, that's cycling back to that whole thing about Wikipedia defining notability based on significant secondary source coverage, is that, since the way that that's defined now is that individuals from underrepresented groups are often underrepresented than on Wikipedia, in part because they're so underrepresented in more traditional media coverage. I mean, this is problematic. And this is something that I think I need to, like Catherine was noting, I need to be more explicit and direct in my instruction about this with students. So anyhow, so this also means the challenge to this, and something that we experienced even in Writing 10 when, and I'll get to that in a moment, this means that Wikipedia pages for these individuals. So for instance, in Writing 10, Elizabeth Salmon found a page for us, or had mentioned that we should create a page for intersectional environmentalism because she found that there was none, which was fabulous. Students were all over that. And it was such a wonderful experience. And students were so motivated and so proud of themselves when they created that. But it ended up getting marked for deletion. So anyhow, the problem with this is that, and I'm not going to say it was trolls, because I don't believe it was trolls. Since I invested kind of in it personally, and so did students, I think we had a sense that it felt like that. But a lot of times, based on this whole thing about the notability and the based on significance and the secondary source coverage thing, that's something that I think needs to be covered too more directly with students, so that they just know that it's coming, potentially, that pages like this could be marked for deletion. Pardon me, I hope you're following me here, can be marked for deletion or vandalized by literally trolls. And anyhow, that's a primary reason for the notability requirements, something that really needs to be emphasized, that I will do in the future. Because I do plan on, so as far as future goes, I do plan on using Wikipedia more in the future and continuing this collaboration, absolutely. I actually have a really awesome collaborative idea pending. I've already, through San Jose State, created a LibGuide, basically copying another LibGuide. And I'm really looking forward to sharing that idea later. But what I might suggest for some of us is that if we're not already doing it, and I'm going to be interested to hear what other people are doing at some point, is that, well, like Elizabeth Salmon did, and I could see some of you are already doing this, or from what I could hear, that is that focusing on a single page for students to edit is easier, it seems to me. And students seem to have a more of a collaborative, coherent experience doing that. And I would also say that perhaps when it comes to like grading and whatnot, it might be easier to track if you're using Canvas to submit links to their edits and or copy and paste of edits to Canvas. I think that's about all I have. So anyhow, it's been a fabulous experience. I mean, students, after they did their intersectional environmentalism post, were clapping for themselves, and it was a really great experience. I did get involved with this back and forth with WikiDan66, who was suggesting we, take it down, and it got kind of tense. I was personally invested, too much so. Elizabeth Salmon taught me a wonderful lesson to not be so personally invested. So it's been a learning curve for me, but I'm there. But anyhow, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle. And we're going to go next to Jen.
Hi, everybody. I forgot the questions. I do have a post-it with my answers, but how I use Wikipedia was over the course of the semester, I really want to emphasize with my writing 10 students that research is a process of inquiry, and I kind of want to give them enough challenge and choice to keep them engaged. And so what I had done for the course is we have a course topic called Interrogating Dominant Ideologies. And it's just basically we talk a lot about dominant ideologies, but students are allowed to select a topic of their choice and research on it. With the course that I tried this with was my morning class, and what I'd done was I gave them the option to kind of have a little creative control over the order in which we did things, and it turned out to work very, very well. But they wanted to begin with their research unit, so I just sort of like folded it into our conversation about what does it mean to be in like public dialogue about particular topics, right? Public discourse, and what does it look like, and where does it take place? We went through the unit first during that research unit, and then we went and did our first session with Elizabeth, and then students continued to work toward creating a synthesis of all of, they did an annotated bibliography. It was like part of the learning unit for early on was annotated bibliography, and then their next big major assignment in the sequence was a synthesis. And after they submitted their synthesis and we'd gone through all of that work, they were allowed to return to wiki pages related to their article, or they were encouraged to return it during our editing session and work on that. I did make this a participation grade, and I did not have like a page number on it, or sorry, not page number, but like, word count or something, because I did not want to invite bullshit from students. But I did want them to be prepared to meaningfully contribute. So having them have that second editing session after they completed the synthesis was very, very useful, because a lot of them were able to just very quickly pull out their sources and, and complete the editing and make meaningful edits. Because by the time there was like, I want to say about 6 to 8 weeks between our first visit post Wikipedia Canvas shell, Canvas module, and our first session, and then our editing session. So by the time they were just learning about, I think it went really well, because it helped them to understand how Wikipedia functions as a public source of discourse, and how it works on the back end, and what that all that research that they're doing, like it's useful in these very important ways, right? And it helps you to meaningfully engage with like these wider discourses. And having so much time between learning about Wikipedia and how to edit on it, and having, opportunities to find pages related to their source that are in need of some gap filling. And then to sort of move through the process of learning more about their topic and becoming in some ways experts, because they're allowed to choose. I didn't set a timer for myself, so I apologize. But a lot that went really, really well. I can't say, like the engagement with editing was, predictably not super even because of just the way allowed them to have that kind of freedom. But I don't regret it, and I think I might try that again. But as far as in the future, I'm going to do it again. And I want to emphasize it more and integrate it a little more fully into their long-term writing process. But it was a wonderful experience. And I think it really gave my students some confidence in their ability to transform that knowledge into something that's, shareable and a way to enter into those discourses. So it was a great experience, and I just wanted to say thank you to our lovely librarians for organizing it and being so supportive. So that was my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you to everybody for presenting. I am going to now turn this over to Sarah, and she is going to talk a little bit about librarian perspectives. So
thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks everyone for sharing how you used it in your classroom. And I am going to try to consolidate some of our librarian perspectives. So Elizabeth and I have met initially to kind of, go over some of our own observations. And I think they align a lot with some of what you all have already been talking about. So let me navigate to this next slide. So the first observation is editing Wikipedia is easy and writing for Wikipedia is hard. So I think we did get the easier task in terms of introducing students to Wikipedia, how to use the platform. I know Catherine mentioned, some things could be a little tricky, but we were actually pleasantly surprised at how students kind of took to the platform and were able to use it. But I think the part about, identifying an information gap, even putting together a sentence or two with other people's writing in particular is actually really tricky. And I know even for myself in preparing for the classes and showing an edit, I'm like, wow, I have to find what's missing in this article. I have to go find a reliable resource. And then I have to write a sentence. So that is just, something that I think really stood out to us in our own work and working with students. And something else that's come up in conversation too is that it can take students a while to feel like they have enough subject knowledge to be able to contribute. And so that's something I've been asking individuals, do you feel like it works at this level for students who are pretty much first year students who are maybe new to topics? So that is one perspective. And moving on to the second one, this is actually using some language that Heather's been using, but before I knew Heather was going to use the sweet spot terminology. I do think figuring out where to put it in the course curriculum, how long of a gap there should be between the library first session and the second session, how much weight to put onto it, those can be a little bit of a challenge. And I have to say thank you to those of you who worked with us to kind of just dive in and try it and see what worked or didn't work. Was really great. People were willing to deal with some ambiguity. But I do think it's just something to consider, this whole thing of, does it fit in with another assignment? The whole Goldilocks thing, what's the porridge that's the right temperature to eat? Where exactly do you put it and where do you frame it? And that again is something that we might have made some suggestions, but ultimately that ended up landing on the instructors. So again, that was something everyone was figuring out. And then the third one is that Wikipedia does have some gotchas. And I think Michelle really spoke to this a lot around notability. With Catherine's group, I ended up doing a session about images, which we didn't do with most of the groups. And I found out that Wikipedia is actually pretty restrictive around the licensing of what images can be used in Wikipedia. So things I kind of assumed we'd be able to use, we weren't allowed to use. We talked a little bit about editing a single Wikipedia page versus having students edit different pages. So another thing that comes up, if everyone's editing the same page, it's not a Google Doc experience. So there can be some conflicts there, and you just have to coordinate around that. So there's just some interesting pieces, and even around the primary, secondary sources. Again, Wikipedia really wants people to use secondary sources. So even, Michelle mentioned this again, with Catherine's class, I was a little bit nervous, like, oh, but they want to reference some things in archives. Like, is this really going to stick or work well? So it was definitely like a learning experience for us. And there's more that we're going to be finding out as you get into the pieces about Wikipedia. So in some ways it's very flexible, and in some ways it's not. So that's part of the gotchas. Some of you talked about student reflections and what you observed about students. These are some themes that came out from another course that we coordinated with, where students wrote some reflections. And so these were the themes that I took out of that course. So students seemed honestly surprised that I can just make an account and start editing. Like, whoa, what's happening? There was also variation between some students became actually more skeptical about using Wikipedia as an information source, or they just felt more enlightened about it. They're like, oh, I now understand why maybe my high school teacher didn't want me to just use this as my sole source of information. Students also seem positive, though, about contributing to a source, though, that was just open for the public. And that came up in our conversations here as well, about students going, hey, I'm making this contribution that's not just like writing for me or writing for my instructor. And then also, it was interesting that students would say things about, it was challenging to know where to contribute, but yet they still recognized that Wikipedia articles were not done, that they were like this work in progress, and more things were needed on them. And this is coming back to the slide that Elizabeth Salmon shared out at the front, that we were really trying to do more of a focus on information creation and evaluation. And these were some of the things we were trying to do with students. I think we were more successful with some of these than others. So for instance, I think most students engaged in basic editing on the Wikipedia platform. So check. I think students, if they were reflecting on it, did learn more about like benefits and limitations of Wikipedia. And students were also, locating credible information often. I think identifying the information gaps was, again, just more of a challenge in part of this. So just something that we were reflecting on, like, was this accomplished? So that's kind of our summary, but we wanted to make sure that we had time for discussion and questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. And, I think a lot of us know each other. We can just ask something verbally. If you want to put it in the chat, we can do that. But now's a great time for questions, and I'll pause for a minute, and if not, then I will ask some other questions. Michelle, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I thought I'd like try to do the take turns thing. Does anybody, I'm just curious, I just want to throw this out there. Does anybody have like a local artist that might come to campus in the fall or the spring that you might, I don't know, I'm trying to be like, I'm being a little evasive here, I understand, but I will get to a point eventually, just not ready yet. Like, is there like, do you have a contact? I'm talking about, and I want a local artist that's preferably, Heather, were you gonna have a question or you have a contribution?
Contribution. I off the top of my head, no. It's kind of a niche thing, but you might consider asking John Boltina. He knows a lot of comic book artists. There was one actually who's really great who lived here. Now he's in Arizona, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would have mentioned him. So yeah, I just want to drop John as a possible contact. I'm not sure how he is with like kind of art on like in other genres, but I know he knows a lot of local comic book artists.
That's cool. Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, because I am looking for, and some of the stuff that he's been doing recently is pretty cool because I'm looking from someone who's representative, underrepresented groups. That's what I'm looking for. And it's related to Wikipedia. So I'll explain later. Jennifer, thank you.
I just have like, I had a question, and then I, based on your answer, I have a possible person to point you toward. What kind of, like sort of what kind of art or style are you looking for? Are you looking for like pop art, like folks who do stuff like, is that a thing we care about?
Anything. I'm totally open because I mean, I'm just gonna, I would put it out there, but I'm just not ready to put it out there yet. It's going to be in collaboration with the librarians, but they don't know it yet. One does. So the idea is and it has to do with, so I'm talking about a Wikipedia edit-a-thon.
Okay.
I already talked to Elizabeth Salmon about this. Sarah, you know you're on board. You want to do this. Okay.
Sure, we can make things happen.
Oh my goodness. So what I was thinking is that we all get together, since we're right here right now, this is the best place to mention it, do a Wikipedia edit-a-thon. We get an artist, we have an artist talk, more than one artist talk. We facilitate some interest. It sounds like fun, and it could be academic or it could be community. And or.
Yeah.
All right. So we might as well just get it going. That's
yeah.
what I'm saying. So just get it going. I already did a LibGuide, or I could point you to the LibGuide that you could just use.
Well, I have an artist I want to recommend to you because she is in that category of sort of people of marginalized identity. And she does, I wish I could show you, if you've ever seen me in person, you've probably seen like some stickers on the back of my laptop. She does graphic art and this kind of thing, like,
oh, that's beautiful.
Right. Yeah. She does sort of, she's called Spoopy Girl on Insta. I'll email it to you, but she's super cool, and she's local to Fresno. She's a Fresno native, and she's in art hops all the time. And she's the first person who came to mind. She I think she'd be down to come and talk for sure, because she's working more on getting her artist profile up these days. So that's one person I know specifically.
Very cool. Okay, so I put a link in there for the librarians and for the rest of you to see. That would be what we would mimic. That's Mount Sax example. And so for anyone that would be, and I say we, I'm just saying it because we're all part of this, and I thought that maybe we could all get together and pool our resources and make something happen of it. And I thought it would be just a lot of fun. And I know that if we wanted, I don't know how much community stuff, that's a separate conversation. And maybe this isn't the conversation that belongs here, but I just wanted to pitch it while everyone was in the same room. Sorry. I'll stop now.
So I'm going to throw out a question again, or just sort of a summary I think most of you use the Wikipedia and used it more as like a participation grade or sort of a journaling grade. Does anyone else want to say more about that? Or if you did something slightly different in terms of, I guess, weight in your class?
I called it a research progress report. It took up 25%, went towards 25% of a grade in my Spark course, for instance, because that's what they were doing.
Okay.
Um,
So you had to be in a pretty big chunk.
I gave them a lot of credit for putting themselves out there. I mean, and taking, because I mean, that's a lot. What's the word I'm looking for when students are, that's a real big jump for students, I think. So maybe someone else has another word for it or a way to describe it.
Like investment.
And Heather, did you want to say more about?
Oh, I think for me it was kind of tied, because I already mentioned this participation journal, but I did it both because like to me, like the act of showing up in the library was kind of like the participation part, but then they also had just that reflecting and doing the pre-research. So I tied that to the journal. So it was, yeah. So I think if I was doing like a whole page like Catherine or Michelle, I'd probably have to make its own assignment period. But yeah, I just tied it in a couple places for that reason.
And Jennifer, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. I tried to keep the stakes low for them so they wouldn't, because like my experience with this, I mean, one, it was like writing 10. So this is really their introduction to, this level of scholarship and things like that. So I didn't want to put too much pressure on them. But I think I might incorporate it more in the sense of like, this is fine. Look for other opportunities for them to contribute in public discourse of, scholarship and discussion. Like I want to also have them like build like a Twitter thread on a topic, right? Public engagement. So yeah, like we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I like the idea of continuing to use it in writing 10 classes, and I will, but I think just in a writing 10 situation, I don't think I want to make that because I don't think they need that kind of pressure just yet, and I think I want to keep the pressure low so that engagement stays high. But I think I'm going to write, since we're throwing out pitches for ideas and things, I'm going to try and build a 2-unit Spark course that talks like that makes as its focus. I have so many students who discuss burnout as, they pick that as like one of their research topics. Usually it's like 3 to 4 every semester. Sorry, my cat can't handle not being the center of attention at all times. But what I would like to do is I had several students talk to me about, managing stress and things like that. And I think that's kind of what I want to build a class around is a Sparks course about, identifying strategies for coping, identifying things that like the community of the university can do to support them and, how they can support one another. And I think that might be an opportunity to do something more like what Michelle and Heather have done, which is like pick or build a Wikipedia page that addresses some of those topics and issues. So that's one thing that I think I might do with and make that more of a bigger part of the project for a Sparks course. But I think when it comes to like writing 10, I worry about the focus because my students just they take things so seriously. You know what I mean? It's not that they won't do it or that they'll do it wrong or whatever. It's like, I worry that they'll, overload themselves a little bit in a writing 10, but in a Sparks course, I feel like it's a little bit more, since that's the focus, I think that might be a better situation, but that's how I would like to continue using Wikipedia and build on these ideas.
And I know, Jen, you mentioned not like having students do a word count And I know when Elizabeth and I have talked to the folks at Wikipedia Education, they have also stressed trying to frame things so that it's not just also strictly on what students wrote, because if it gets edited or deleted, you don't want all the emphasis on that. And I think that's where also incorporating like reflection about what they did, or if it's connected to like other assignments or pieces of assignments, can be useful. And I do want to call out that when we saw Gen students for the editing, because they were taking things from their paper that they had written, and she had done a lot of work around informative writing, that seemed very successful, because Wikipedia also requires like certain kind of writing, it can't be like opinion or flowery or anything like this.
Right.
Heather?
Yeah, we put it after the synthesis, and I emphasize the EYE versus I, before their big argument paper. So that really helps. Sorry, go ahead. I'm going to shut up.
No, that's and by the way, I mentioned in chat, but I love that you had this. We do that in class too, but I love that you had like kind of a bigger space after the annotated. I think that was probably really helpful. I now wish we'd done that Wikipedia there. The discussion about the personal also reminded me, like, we had talked about editing the UC Merced page, because especially when you look at other UCs, it's just like there's not a lot of information. And then realized, Sarah and Elizabeth reached out to me. They're like, we just realized that's not going to probably fly because it's not very objective, because the UC students are editing it, which I feel like, oh yeah, it should have been obvious. But yeah, again, there's just that's kind of like another gotcha. But, also, yeah, just that thinking of like, what does a personal mean in this case too, is something to think about.
Yeah, there's definitely a few of those. Well, I'm looking at the time, and I know people have lives and probably grading and all of these other things, but I want to thank you again all so much for collaborating with us and then taking time to share it with others. And I also want to thank Elizabeth again for also kind of going with it this semester, trying something a little bit different. And I hope you all have a great summer, and that we will see you in person or on Zoom or both. And please reach out if you have other questions. And I'm sort of making an assumption that you can also feel free to reach out to each other and share what you're doing, or if people have questions.